4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hello, testing, testing, testing.
Sí, hola.
Hoy tenemos la sesión, digamos, más...
Good morning. Today we will have a session more focused on economy because economy also has an effect on other aspects. Like I mentioned yesterday, security, economic security. We have with us Federico Steinberg, that is well known here and has been with us several years. He's now in Washington, and Federico is an economist that works in Elcano and now is in the U.S. in Georgetown. We also have with us Inmaculada Lopez. She was director of an economic advisor when I was a minister many, many years ago.
¿Cuántos? No, mejor no lo contemos.
Let's better not talk about those times. She's lately also worked in London, and for some years now, she works in my cabinet as economic advisor. And then we have, well, I think it's better that you introduce yourself, Verdi, because you're new to us, so please introduce yourself.
For the translation to come through. So thank you all. My name is Yorgos Verdi, and I'm a researcher with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I work on digital technology, the geopolitics of technology. So we'll be very happy later, after their presentations are done, to speak a bit about that. Thank you.
Es decir, la tecnología y la economía. Vamos entrando en el terreno cada vez más más cercano, más yuxtapuesto, más implicado de la economía, la tecnología y la seguridad. Y fundamentalmente yo lo conozco y os aconsejo que lo hagáis por lo que publican las redes. Pero tú trabajas con SFR.
Sorry, the translation is not coming through. I have technological problems.
We have a technological problem. Los demás, ¿no tienes traducción?
What was the question? Sorry.
Why do we have translation? Try now. Sí, ahora. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Por qué levantáis la mano? Ah, vale, muy bien. No, I was asking you, you work with the CFR, European Council of Foreign Relations. Bueno, entren en las...
You should look at what Verdi has written in the social networks, talking about competitivity.
Que es la seguridad. De manera que como tenemos tres ponentes, hoy...
Last frontier, which is security. As we have 3 speakers today, this is going to be an intense session this morning. Get ready for it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the High Representative for inviting me. For 2 years, I've been in Washington, and the last 2 years I wasn't able to join this course, but I'm very much pleased that I was able to come this year and that I've been able to come in the past. And in fact, I would like to give you a view what I've called the new paradigm of economy and what we have to do regarding the economy. And I will talk about the Copernican turn of the dominant ideas in economic policy in general terms in the world that usually starts in the US and is now getting to Europe with a bit of delay. And also I will talk about the US and about some issues that you've asked me to talk about regarding the situation because of the next elections in November and how it's going to fundamentally affect us in Europe and in the rest of the world. So basically, I would like to do 3 things. First of all, to explain what the Copernican turn of the global economy policy means. When we look at history books and they talk about the big stages and the dominant ideas in economic policy, they will say that in the 19th century there was an hegemony of wild liberalism, and then we will talk about classic liberalism with the New Deal and with the growth of the welfare state. And here we will have Polanyi's, if you want to look at the theoretical side of things. Then since the 70s, with the oil crisis, we have the growth of what we denominate neoliberalism and hyperglobalization. And these are the hegemonic ideas with which we've grown up. Those of us here, I'm 47, and when I studied economy, everything was efficiency, globalization, the good things in the market, and that was the end of it. And at some point in the decade of the 2010s, so we could say, or we could talk about the financial crisis, the pandemic, and the return of the ideas of the more state and less market, even though state and market are always complementary. One cannot be explained without the other. And I believe we are in a new paradigm in which the dominant ideas are not so much efficiency, but security, where the industrial policy comes back, as well as the state policy. Remember that in the pandemic, everything was state. With the financial crisis, we had the recovery of the banks through the state, that the pandemic generates a demand of health security. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia also has an effect on security in Europe, and so on and so forth. So we are at that point in time in which it is difficult to see what is really happening, but when we look at it from the future, we will see it clearly. I don't know how long this stage will last, but we're just coming into it, and this has many effects regarding the economy, globalization, and so on. Secondly, because Europe is adopting this new paradigm, and I should say that they're doing so with some problems, because as Lucas Tsoukalis explained yesterday, in our DNA we have free trade, cooperation, multilateralism, and that world in which Europeans in general terms feel more comfortable, and that little by little is being affected by different issues, many of them geopolitical. So we need to go one step forward, and this I believe it's a new trilema. We love trilemas for globalization and so on and so forth, and this was not something I came up with. It's from a Spaniard, but basically Europeans have to do three things, and we don't know how to do them. We need to be able to invest a lot, and this was mentioned yesterday, on security, green transition, energy transition, digitization, and so on and so forth. We need to be able to not have a public debt crisis with fiscal rules that we've just reformed that give us a little bit more of margin, but not too much. And we need to achieve to do so with a political consensus, even though there's not much, and with federal instruments and not national instruments to not affect the internal market. So with a bigger budget and with joint debt, but how do we do this? With more taxation from Brussels, how do we do this? And the Americans have already done this. In the US, there's no budget restriction. There's no conservatism in taxation. Democrats want to increase the expenses, and the Republicans want to reduce taxes. All the projections gave us a deficit of 6% of the GDP, with an economy that is growing at high rates and with unemployment under 4%. So according to macroeconomic books, it would be the time to adjust the accounts. But no, because they have the dollar, they can do so. We Europeans do have budgetary restrictions, sometimes self-imposed by the German finance minister, so depending on how markets are going. Or fortunately, we're not in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. We have a European Central Bank that has come of age. In fact, some years ago, we've talked about when the European Central Bank didn't behave as it should or as a central bank. And if there's problems, for example, in the French elections, they talked about the French debt, and the ECB will purchase this European debt. There's no doubt about this. And doing whatever they can with the treaties, but this doesn't mean that we have the space to move that we would want to. And finally, I would like to end with specific proposals, and all of this in 20 minutes. So let me continue. In Keynes' general theory, he says something, and I'm not being literal, but he says that all politicians that believe are great in their new visions really are slaves of some economists that already passed away, whose ideas come back through the back door. And that's the idea, more or less. And this is to highlight that economists love to speak about interests, political scientists love to speak about institutions, but the narrative and the dominant ideas in a specific point in time in the history of the world economy is very important. And we can say we are at a moment of change, of dominant ideas in which things that were radical before become mainstream and are possible. And we have many examples. 20 years ago, to talk about a green tax was being a radical ecologist, extreme left wing, and now it's something considered in all of Europe. Or we should say that the industrial policy, or the best one, was the one that didn't exist, was set by a minister in Spain some years back, many years back, in the 80s. But now ask the US what industrial policy is with inflation reduction, ask the infrastructures, industrial policy with a more modern policy, but at the end of the day, the state intervening somehow. So first of all, there's a change in ideas that happens because of different events, and here geopolitics are fundamental. Geopolitics is bringing the ideas of how just in time and not having anything stored like paracetamol that was mentioned yesterday, or talking about interdependence and the most liberal ideas regarding hyperdependence and hyperglobalization, and how interdependence was used as a weapon. The weaponization of interdependence is the trend now in academia. Abraham Newman is the one to coin this phrase, and he's in Georgetown, in fact, and maybe in some naive way he said this, the weaponization of interdependence, and that is the use of economic interdependence as a weapon and not as a source of economic profits, which is something happening with Russian gas, for example, even with individuals. When the migrants or refugees are transferred in a compulsory manner to create problems in other places, with paracetamol, with the materials needed for electric batteries, and so on. So we're going through this change in which ideas come first, and when ideas change, they generate different policies, and only after some years this is shown in the data, in the trade data, in investment data, and this is what I will be showing you on the next slide, because these ideas of less state and more market still do not mean a clear or they're not being globalization. There's just a change. And it's clear, as you can see here, that the peak of globalization in trade on the GDP will be somehow delayed. I will come back to this because I know we will be discussing this graph, but let me first of all express these two main ideas. In general terms, what is at stake, which is the last thing on the slide, is that the decision or the trade-off, as economists say, between economic efficiency and other things. Other things are things like security, or having more grantees, or for it to be more difficult but have poor trust on not having a lack of supplies. In the stage of hyperglobalization, efficiency was above everything, but now we are at a point in time in which considerations of financial security have more weight than efficiency on many aspects. But this trade-off is understood differently in different countries. For example, the US has decided that a Chinese electric car won't go into the country, and that's it. And if it's more expensive to manufacture in the US, we will pay for it. And if from the industrial standpoint it wasn't clear enough, the argument that they will be testing very soon is that the electric car is a threat to security because it's a center to transmit data. So this is the last interpretation on security, and they say, I want to manufacture this at home to recover the industry at home. In Europe, where the duties are not so high, we don't consider this trade-off to be so big, and therefore we don't want to delay the energy transition just not to have Chinese cars. We still want them to come. We want them to have their manufacturing plants. We want them to pay for the duties and for there to be loyal competitiveness. But therefore, we will be doing things differently. But the U.S. is wealthier and can afford some of these elements because they don't have budgetary restriction. Here I have several graphs. Let me break them down. First of all, we have world exports and imports of goods. So from the 90s to 2008, this is from Richard Baldwin, one of the best ones studying globalization. They have a peak around 2008, 2009. So hyper-globalization was reached right before the financial crisis. Then it's been more stable, going up and down, but the trend doesn't continue to grow. It doesn't really have a significant drop, and the trade of services continues to be very dynamic. As you might be aware, with technologies, it's very easy to buy and sell. But the goods trade is the one exposed to duties, sanctions, and new hurdles, which means there's a delay or a stabilization of this goods trade. This is also linked to how supply chains in the world, and that China expanded in the 90s and 2000s, have reached their limit. Because breaking down the production system, we reach a point where this cannot be broken down anymore. So we reach a point that is a one-off, and that has now been stabilized. So we could discuss more, but this opens the door. Yes, you have something to add? So the last figures from 2019, well, we still don't have the figures, but I can get them to 2020. But I liked this image because they were all together in the same graph. I knew this was a comment that, because I remember some of the discussions we've had regarding the graph and data. That's why I also wanted to include data. The last figure is from 2020, but what I was more interested in the trend. The goods trade is stabilized, services continues to grow. What we start to see is the sectorial geographical differences, and also we have the issue of manufacturing, because Trump believes that what's important are goods, and behind is the philosophy of the decline of the U.S. being linked to the decline of the idyllic model of the 50s that wasn't so idyllic, in which the father of the family worked in a car manufacturer and they had a wonderful house, and the wife didn't work, and we have to go back to that, and you also of course need to have a dog. But this is very much linked to the idea of manufacturing, so we need to put duties on Chinese manufacturing when there's more trade of services, digital consulting, legal services, every time you watch a movie on Netflix, for example. And we also have all these new terms when we talk about globalization: nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring. That means to bring closer what I manufacture, to trade only with friends. This is a very hot issue in the US, because the evil are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and maybe Venezuela is in this list once again. They were not on the list because now the Venezuelan oil was very useful with the problem with Russia. So we need to trade with those that are not a threat for our security, which are those four, but this list can be extended. In Europe, we don't like this logic so much. But reshoring and nearshoring, bringing things closer to where we are, protectionism, strategic autonomy, which is the European version of this, financial security, sanctions, and all this somehow becomes this debate between de-risking and decoupling. And it's the first time in which the U.S. uses these European terminology, de-risking, from Jane Sullivan, which probably is the person that has more effect in the Biden administration, and in a very famous conference from April 2023 in the Brookings Institution, talks about how we need to reform the international order to be more aware of this, and how globalization hasn't been positive for the U.S., and that there are two things that both U.S. Parties agree on, and that is that globalization has been not that good for the U.S. Both of them believe that, and it has to be reformed, and that China is the enemy because it's a risk for American hegemony much more than the former USSR. And in the rest of issues, they do not agree. Europeans are addressing this idea of reducing risks, not so much decoupling. The Republican Party will be more interested in an almost full decoupling of the American economy from the Chinese. And this is something we will see more and more in technology sectors and sectors that have to do with security, and not so much in textile industry and other industries. In any case, the EU in this context is doing things a bit differently, and using what the High Representative said around 5 years ago, we have to learn how to use the language of power, not to become part of the menu of global geopolitics, but to be part of those enjoying the meal. So this European power that needs at least to have teeth to be able to bite. So this is something we've used in economic strategy, but also in security. Europeans would like to maintain two key issues. First of all, a world with no nationalisms or imperialisms. The European project is many things. Tsakalis explained this wonderfully yesterday, but I would say that the European project is a way of overcoming nationalism and imperialism that brought us to where it brought Europe. So the effort of working on this in Europe, something we haven't achieved as much as we would like to when we are pro-European, but that we're still working on, and forgetting about nationalist trading non-cooperative positions. Unfortunately, the world that is coming is a world of neo-imperialism and neo-nationalism, clearly in the case of Russia, but also many other places. And we mentioned this yesterday too. On the other hand, Europe, the EU, in its documents with nuances, doesn't believe multilateralism has fully died, let's say. In the US, the World Trade Organization is dead and won't be coming back. The US won't be signing any free trade agreement in the next years, whoever wins. The Republican Party has become protectionist, and the Democrats already were. Maybe there will be an agreement with Taiwan that will have more to do with security, and when they review the free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada next year, the only thing that they are concerned about is for there not to be any Chinese car manufacturers in Mexico or Canada. This is one of their main concerns. However, Europeans, and as we said yesterday, we trade, we are very open. This world with no rules and no trade can damage us much more. And the U.S. has less weight in the world economy, and many of the emerging countries. I don't like the term global south. I like a plural south, global north. I don't know, something like that. Many have an interest in having a trade system that is more or less open with some rules, and we're trying to replicate or at least have bilateral agreements. What's the problem that we have as Europeans? That each time we're going to have a free trade agreement or with someone, we have our list, which are our values. Environmental sustainability, you haven't approved the Paris Agreement, climate change.
So We have a certain number of issues to include in the trade policy. All these clauses are great for us as Europeans, but we have to measure, and we haven't achieved a trade agreement with Australia. Well, it's not so much different. Of course, they have more farming, and the Mercosur agreement is stuck. India would be a key country to have a free trade agreement with this reconfiguration. We are eager to be closer to India. So therefore, we have to recalibrate. And as it has been mentioned yesterday, the only way to be present about giants is more interaction and more movement. So interactions, and this is closely linked to the far right movement. And when we go deeper into the economic strategy, that we have a lot of what I know is noted on this slide, but we have to underscore the fact that the EU is not quite prepared to address this change. Because in the EU, we separated the part of the commercial economy and the exterior and pure economy. So trade, we had to increase efficiency, and foreign policy was on the other side. So when we have to talk about issues related to the economic security is not a term in the treaties. This economic security is closely linked to the national security, and national security is in the hands of the member states and not of the EU. So we are juggling through the trade policy that can be achieved or adopted by qualified majority. We can also deal with exports, with reinvestment in other states. So that's what we have done. We have an array of tools, the anti-coercion instrument tool, that is to say, that is, if a country tries to blackmail us and tries to boycott our companies. For example, the example of Lithuania a few years ago. If China says they have to block textile products in Europe, we haven't got to react because it's not infringing the World Trade Organization. But we also are seeking for a new set of tools with trade policies, banning all the investments done outside the Europe, and they would be competing with the member states that are a part of the EU. So this has been materialized in the strategy of economic security of last month of June, and these are documents that are not sound for the time being, the communication of the Commission, but also the High Representative. This is a foreign policy. The foreign policy is here on the table, and in a certain way, it is quite similar to the economic security doctrine of the US. With Biden at the White House, and I hope that it would be very soon with Kamala Harris, the U.S. tries to, for us, the Europeans, to be in line with the U.S. in the Chinese policy at a 50%. But we are not quite sure that it is what we really want to address this issue. We have an autonomous position. We are allies of the U.S. Of course, we are partners in security and defense in the NATO, but we might not want to have the same taxes to the cars, for example, Chinese cars. U.S. has banned the American companies to invest in China without authorization. So this is quite strict. They have done that in a granular way. So in AI, semiconductors, biotechnology, and you might imagine what it is, what does that mean? And we are facing a situation where we have to navigate among two waters. So what can we do? To do it right, we have to have this trilema. So we have investment. We also have to reform the European governance. What about the debt? These are, we have this average debt we have. It's lower than the U.S. The U.S. has not reached political consensus to cut down the debt. You can see the U.S. companies here. In the States, the ratio is 128 of the GDP. It is 15 points higher than the average of the EU. You have all the European countries. They estimate it up to 2034. We have in Europe the fiscal rules, and here we have the figures. If we grow in Europe, we have done that up to 2034. Now we are we have Germany with 63, Portugal 97, Spain 106. You have all the details on the slide. So the underlying message here. Now the US, it's the graph on the right side. It's a different source. So all the public debts have increased with the pandemic. We are adjusting that. Inflation is eating up the debt, but the limitations imposed by the new fiscal rules is what it is. So, second element, the investment, the R&D as a percentage of the GDP. We have got China on the top, Japan, the US, that is leading as well. And so I have all the figures about the needs of investments in the green transition, digital transition, and defense. We have less data, but we need, and the Letta report addresses that, to move the European saving to channel investment. We need 5 points of GDP investment to cover the needs estimated in the green transition that has a part of transportation and energy systems. Digital transition we will address later on. And in defense, I have written down the 100,000 billion of euros. So we have a budget of the EU that is 1% of the GDP, and we have to increase our fiscal capacities. What about the U.S.? In its industrial policy with the CHIPS Act, we has been able to increase investment in informatics or in computer science and IT, electronics, and electricity. So in red, you can see the investments that are linked to the digital economy. So it is surprising how they have been able to articulate that. The Inflation Reduction Act, it is another package which is quite ambitious and has faced a certain number of reimbursement issues, but the CHIP package is really great in terms of increase. This is the last idea. We have to close the loop, and we have to have a bigger budget. We have to have a common tax policies for the states to have that they have a great margin. They can help the companies, and here we have 3 different options. The member state shouldn't put more money, or we have to have European taxes. For example, the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we will have to create a certain number of taxes, no taxation without representation. And so we need a certain number of fiscal capacity in Brussels of the European parliaments, or joint debt emission. So joint debt issuance. And they have to have a balanced budget. We cannot have a deficit. We cannot issue debt because there are no bonds. It is, we have been talking about that about 20 years. This could be the solutions. And the capital unions. In Europe, we have a lot of savings, but this, at the end, funds startups in London and in Silicon Valley. So Europe has to adjust to its new world paradigm without missing the past. We have to move forward. We have to be focusing on economic security with an idea in mind that they can hurt us. So we consider that we are good, and the good is not harming others. But we have realized that some consider us as good, but not always. So they can do nasty things. So we have to get ready. The Chinese, the Americans, the Japanese have all that much clearer than us. So we need to have fiscal tools for all that, and we mustn't forget that the background is just to cut down the causes of the anti-Europeism. We demand redistribution, and also we have to face the cultural battle, and I have no idea how to solve that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias.
Thank you to the organizers, first of all, for inviting me and to have the opportunity to address these issues. Thank you to Josep Borrell for inviting me. And in my presentation, I will try not to repeat what has been already said, and I don't want to also address things that are going to be addressed by Giorgio later on. I'm going to address a certain number of issues that are well known, but that are quite relevant. In this new paradigm of political security, we have to make decisions. The issue of economic security and governance is a key issue. So I will address a certain number of topics and to better understand the complexity of these issues. We talk about Europeans, but we do not realize enough that the European Union is not a state. The EU is a partnership of 27 member states with different visions, and it is very difficult to know or to see what is the European vision. Europe has no visions in many respects. So I'm going to address these aspects of economic safety. I'm not going to talk about all the issues related with stability, but I will address the monetary policies of the security. So, and at the end, I will talk a little bit about competitiveness. The challenge of the governance for the EU, we are facing a greater challenge than the challenges faced by other countries. We have to decide where the EU can act. And sometimes we forget the fact that it is mentioned in the treaty. EU is an institution that abides by a certain number of rules. We have to implement the rules that are governing our behavior and actions. And a major principle of the treaty is the principle of attribution. The EU cannot act outside the frontiers or the limitations, the competencies that have been assigned by the EU. So, yes, we have a certain number of competencies where the European Commission cannot enter. And also it is mentioned that the national security issues in the Article 4 of the EU Treaty are issues that are for the member states. The treaties are giving to the EU states those functions that are closely into the nuclear aspects of the states, the national sovereignty. Another major aspect of the sovereignty is the foreign policy. The foreign policy is quite specific, and also there is another activity which is important in the hands of the EU are the taxes. Taxes are for the EU member states, and to approve them they require unanimity. So we have to have a budget in the Union of 1% of the GDP. The EU cannot impose their own taxes, and the member states don't want it to be like that. So many member states do not want to give more competences to the EU. So where can the EU act and how? The EU has to act two ways. In the community way method, the EU proposed a certain number of proposals that are negotiated with the Parliament and the Council, and they are after passed. And also, the decisions are taken by the Council, the qualified majority, which is quite easier. And once these decisions are passed, the Commission is going to execute them. But then also we have the measures of the intergovernmental measures. These are those measures of the foreign common policy that are regulated in a different way, specifically through a certain number of articles of the Treaty of the EU that requires unanimity. And they have to be proposed by the High Representative, and they are put forward the Council, and the Council of the Foreign Office decide if these measures to be passed or not. Unanimity is a strong limitation in the decision-making processes. I won't say that many things have been passed. That's not the case. But in the next slide, I would like to address the different tools of the economic security of the EU. But beforehand, I would like to share with you an experience when I reached Brussels in February 2022. I was in my office, and the head of office told me that I had to accompany a Japanese delegation. They wanted to be looking at the economic security. And there I had a meeting with them. And after a presentation, they told me they just wanted to talk about what they were doing. They were going also to go to the presidency office, but they just wanted us to listen to them. So I said, all right. They just wanted to talk about the transformation in the governance that has been taking place in the Japanese government. And why this transformation? And they told me for two reasons. First of all, for the greater position and weight of China in the world, and because of the lack of a world agreement and the rules related to technology and IT, and that is going to lead us to big issues and concerns. They were quite preoccupied with the fact that China, with its new technologies of communication, was becoming a big brother. So the head of the delegation told us, George Orwell, in its book, told us about the fact that the state could be a big brother and could control the citizens. And this is happening. It is a reality today and could be happening in the rest of the world. That's why we are very concerned and we are taking a certain number of measures. So they told me that they were really concerns because the security issues and to be integrated with the economy, and we cannot have two independent silos. That's why we have to transform the government. We will have a department for the economy security, but we will also have within the safety units, we will have a unit for the economic security. At the time, in 2022, we did not talk about this economic security. We talked about sovereignty, strategic autonomy. We started talking about economic security last year. So with this geopolitical transformation of the world, I am using in my talk a certain number of concepts that are not perfectly defined: the security, economic security, geoeconomy. We use terms to describe this new situation, and the economic security is one of those. Japan was at the head of all the economic security in the G7 last year, and has been mentioned by Federico, we passed a strategy of economic security in the Commission. So I just wanted to briefly talk about what are all these measures that we have for the economic security and the obstacles we face. First of all, we have all the measures of the community method. These measures are easier to apply because they are applied by the Commission, and we have demands a qualified majority. But the measures as the economic security that are considered the hardcore of the strategies are the measures that are at the bottom, the economic sanctions. And it is the case for Europe as well, because the greatest offense or attack is the sanctions that we have applied to Russia. These are have been a real decoupling. We have being implemented a wide array of sanctions, controls to exports, to prevent technology to get to Europe, to also have the price cap in order to limit the price of the oil exported, the freezing of assets, and the foreign policy has an immense capacity to implement measures that hasn't got the community method, but they require this unanimity. Federico has mentioned the different measures applied by the Commission, the anti-subsidies measures that is going to be, and these measures. The Commission has passed a certain number of taxes. These measures will be applied in a few months, and the Commission has a unique competence of the EU in this respect, and the Commission has the power in hands. And to implement this measure, Germany is not agreeing with this measure, but France and Spain is okay. So the Commission will have to apply the traditional measures. Not we talk about them as measures of economic security, although they haven't got this security component. They have a geopolitical impact. So they have an impact on the foreign relationship with China, and they are considered as a part of the measures of the took of this economic security. We also have other measures that have been applied by the Commission. A certain number of autonomous measures that have been created on a legal basis, that is not the multilateralism of the WTO. It has been created by the EU to defend itself from China as instrument. As the Chinese close the market to the European companies, so the European Commission has also filed a few months ago, or you are going to open your market, or I'm going to implement sanction. And so we are hoping the Chinese will react. All these great gap, for example, the competence policy, it is in the hands of the European Commission without any paper of the Council, where we have opened an investigation to see if an Arab company wants to buy Czech telecommunication companies. We suspect there are subsidies there. So we are going to hinder this process and to avoid investments in the foreign investment. And another instrument which is of major importance is the industrial policy. But what happens with the industrial policy? It is there is no money at the European level. So this industrial policy requires a great amount of funds. And so these funds are non-existent currently. So the industrial policy, on the basis of the competence attribution, is blocking Europe in a certain way. It is just a supporting measure. The member states are applying these policies, and the EU is only going to uphold these member states. And also the European industrial policy of the EU, there are no security consideration. When the US, with its CHIPS Act, is going to give funds to the companies, there are a certain number of conditions. If I give you this money, you won't be able to invest in China for a period of 10 years. So there are a certain number of incitations and for not only bans, but also incitations and subsidies for the companies not to go to China. But this is non-existent in our legislation, in the Net Zero Industrial Act. It is a measure for the industrial policy to react to the inflation, the CHIPS Act in the US. It is a previous measure that has is only a carrot in a way, is not sanction. And also there is another act, critical raw materials, in order to solve all the issues we have regarding the high dependence on China in the critical raw materials. But all these acts are devoid of real content because we need money. So in the next pluriannual period in 2028, there's going to be a huge negotiation because we have to negotiate the budget for 7 years. So there, the US will decide if they want to get deploy money for all these investments.
Finally, we have these national security measures that sometimes are believed to be measures of the Commission, but this Commission has nothing to do with them, even though the Commission is trying to wound what they do with other instruments. With the anti-corruption instrument, for example, it's tried to see how the Commission is dealing with national security and trying for them to adopt the decisions that at the end of the day have to do with foreign affairs policies or security policy. This instrument is an instrument that if China pressures, for example, Lithuania, like it did in the past, so that they change a specific policy, or I threat you with an embargo, this is a violation of the sovereignty of a country, and this instrument has been created to face those trade measures that can be applied by either China or the US. What is happening, and this is a measure that has the nature of being a sanction. We have to or want to react to China's pressure, maybe with trade measures. So the Commission made a proposal, but when it's negotiated with the Council and the Parliament, they say, no way, this is a foreign affairs policy, and no way can it be in the way that it's in the proposal, because it wouldn't be legal. And there's a very difficult negotiation that brings them to a measure that even the negotiators, the Parliament, the Council and the Commission have considered to be exceptional and promised that will never happen again. Why? It's a measure, a trade measure, that for the first time in history, the implementation is not of the Commission through an implementing act, but the Council. And the Council will be deciding essentially if this is happening or not. And the Council, many countries, many member states were saying this had to be through unanimity, and they said, no way. So there were tense negotiations trying to fight this coercion, and this is an instrument that will be applied by the Commission and that has been negotiated with Japan and others on coercion issues. So at the end of the day, we have an operating structure where we see how Europe has great difficulties to act. And what the Commission is trying to do at the end of the day is to use a strategy that helps them work on these proposals. What are the 4 alternatives to the challenge of governance? First of all, to reform treaties. Right now, there's an ongoing discussion. Last year, there was some momentum, and even Mario Draghi, in his national speech, said that we couldn't do anything without reforming a treaty, something that seems to be impossible, but it requires the implication of the member states. So we need to both reform the treaties, but at the same time it seems impossible. The Parliament has made a proposal to reform them with more than 300 amendments, and it was approved with a very small majority. So we're not going to change the treaties, but to change the rules for unanimity. So there is a clause that allows or would allow to change the unanimity demands, for example, in foreign affairs sanctions, which would be very helpful. This clause needs the unanimity of the European Council. Even though this is easier, it's also difficult to achieve. Another strategy is reinforced cooperation that has never really worked. If there is no agreement between the 27, at least to have an agreement between some. This is what has recently happened, and I would like to focus on this. One of the main stars to improve competitiveness now is the Capital Market Union. One of those slogans or mottos that the EU propagates, but for 10 years, and this was talked about 10 years ago for the first time. There's been projects towards the union of the capital markets, but minimum steps have been given to achieve so. So now when we find so many difficulties to fund our enormous investments, so there's a type of consensus that we need to do everything possible, and let's see if we get this unity, the Letta report also highlights this. Why? Because Europe has a problem, and that is that most of its funding, 2/3 come from banks, and only 1/3 of its funds come from the capital market, bonds, and so on and so forth. And this is not good to fund all the innovative companies and startups that don't have access to these bank loans because they don't have assets, they don't have any background information, and therefore they don't receive loans because they're quite risky projects. We've known this for some time now, and now we're trying to make our special effort. But in April, May, the Council says, yes, we need to try and achieve this unity of capital markets. A month later, there is a meeting of the ministers in the ECOFIN, and they say it's impossible after 4 hours discussion, and there's no consensus reach on any specific measures to be implemented, because now we need, for example, a single supervisor of all stock markets with an homogeneous regulation. Right now we have a body chaired, in fact, by José María Campan from Spain, but they have almost no powers. And this proposal that seems to be, according to the experts, a before and after. Luxembourg says this is absolutely impossible because 1/3 of the GDP depends on financial systems, and this would be a regulatory load that is impossible for us. And I don't want to have in the same place the taxes of company taxes, for example, or capital from others. Ireland also saying that it won't change the taxation system because this is a power of the state. Ireland has a dependency of this model of bringing investments through their type of taxation. Sweden is also saying that they won't support it because I'm very pleased with my capital market because it's small and works really well. So a proposal that has the support of France and Germany, but won't, I believe, move forward because there are some member states that are against. So this illustrates the difficulties of Europe to be able to put something in place and at the end of the day apply its security strategy. And now I will go on to speak about the monetary policy. I was supposed to speak about 3 challenges: stability, and this has to do with stability, with price and debt stability, 2 important parts of macroeconomic stability. I will be focusing on this stability, this currency stability, and this last years we've seen growth of inflation that has been solved. We don't know if it's fully solved, but look at this graph. We see the inflation in the Eurozone, which is the blue line, since it starts growing in 2021, reaching its peak in August or September 2022. And from there on, we have a strong deceleration, and therefore the European Central Banks is able to reduce rates. So we can see that there's more or less good news. In this inflation stage, what's happened is not what happened in the past, that usually was a restriction to employment or job creation, maybe because of the shocks, the shock of the pandemic, supply chains, and the oil shock, which has also had an effect in Europe, as well as natural gas and its rise in prices, has meant that jobs have been maintained, and that is the most reasonable explanation. So therefore, it's been a cycle that has been quite special. I would like to highlight that since the recovery of the inflation starts up till now, or even before that, we've gone from a world in which we believed that there were no inflation possibilities. Interest rates were at almost zero. Economists talked about secular stagnation. There's a world of no investment, no growth. Therefore, public debt can increase because the service is very small because interest rates are quite low. But after the pandemic, we start with the high inflation, interest rates going up, and now we're in a totally different world in which after the Ukraine war, there's geopolitical shocks. We have to bear in mind climate change. It's what Christine Lagarde calls the second best world. So European central banks are getting prepared to a different world to the ones we've had in the last 30 years, and how we're going to have different effects on the economy. On this slide, we see the evolution of interest rates of central banks with their instruments in policy in the history of the Eurozone. At the end, we see the blue line for the European Central Bank, and how the European Central Bank, since it starts to rise interest rates in June 2022 till September 2023, there's a 10 rise of interest rates, then they are stable, and they are at the highest level that they've had ever been in the Eurozone. So it's quite a restrictive policy that in the case of Europe and the US has continued to grow. And we've had less growth than in the US, but in any case, and as you can see, we find ourselves in a situation of an interest rate of 4% many years after the global crisis in 2008. Central banks started to reduce interest rates to boost the economy. They reduced. There was no boost on the economy till we reached zero and even negative rates. So the Germans were paying the investors for the bonds, but now we live in a different situation, and the ECB has put in place another measure, as they couldn't work on interest rates because they were so low. They used this instrument to purchase assets that will be very relevant in the future, and that has two objectives. In the graph on the left, we see the evolution in different central banks. The blue line is the one for the ECB, and we see the ECB starts to purchase this assets from the private sector, but also from governments. They stay in my balance, so I help in the funding of governments because there's a higher demand of these assets. And Europe starts in 2014. With the pandemic, there's a new program, the pandemic program. And there's a transaction with 700 million that is later doubled. So it's a spectacular purchase. And here on the graph on the left, we see that the weight of these assets that have been accumulated in the ECB starts to drop. And on the graph to the right, which is very interesting, we see how the responsibility for the drop of this weight is not the program created during the pandemic, because the ECB when they purchase a bond, an asset, and it's vintage, what they do is to refinance, to acquired again, and then it's a part of its balance again. And this blue line that corresponds to the pandemic program is horizontal, and even till the end of the year, they will continue buying. Why is it important for the ECB to buy these bonds from the government? Because this has been the formula used by the European Central Bank, not only to expand the economy when interest rates were very low and trying to do everything possible to provide liquidity and therefore to have an economic growth, but also in the cases in which the markets are in what we economists call evil balances, when there are doubts regarding the solvency of a specific government, and at the time bonds are being sold and interest rates grow, there is a cycle there that can bring us from a simple liquidity crisis to become a banking crisis or a debt crisis. That's why the ECB in the Eurozone, and with the Mario Draghi communication, says we're going to do everything possible to not destroy the Eurozone. So what they're saying is we're going to buy all the debt that is necessary so that risk premiums don't rise in the case of governments having a stabilization program that was created later on with the outright monetary transactions. That is a tool of the ECB that has never been used, but the existence of the tool launches to the market the idea that the ECB is going to buy the bonds as soon as there is a peak that is not justified, or because there is a panic in the markets, and therefore thus containing risk premiums. And now I'm going to focus on here on the part of the end. You see in yellow Spain. When we were in the Eurozone, the risk premium compared to Germany was different, then it becomes zero. And we've been thus until the crisis of the Eurozone. And it is then when the market starts to realize, wow, we are in the Eurozone, but governments have different risks. And that's when we start with the risk premium rising, and I'm not going to explain how it is solved, but we go on to this stage at the end where risk premiums can be much more controlled. But what is happening when the ECB decides, well, I have to stop with the purchase of bonds after the pandemic? I announced that this is going to stop, and at the time markets get nervous, and risk premiums for Italy start to grow, not so much for Spain, also for Greece. And that's when, in 2022, the ECB launches a new tool. A new tool that is different to the monetary transaction that I mentioned before. And they say when there are movements that are not justified by the fundamentals, I'm going to intervene. This has controlled risk premiums up to when we had the French elections in June. And here we see also a rise of the rates in France. And we are in a situation that you cannot appreciate clearly here. We can see it better on the next slide. I'm almost finished. As I was saying, this rise, because the last data we have is from August, has brought us to a situation for stability in France, which is quite complex because France has too much deficit. It has a public debt that has risen, as Federico already explained, and excessive deficit, as the Commission has already declared, and therefore they have to put in place serious measures. And these measures have to be implemented in September. with according to the new stability rules. They have to put in place these measures, but markets are expectant to see what is done in France, because if they apply or put in place what Le Pen wants to do or the left wants, there will be no stability. And in this case, the ECB has said, in that case, we will allow the market to keep operating, because in this case, it just means that the French are being irresponsible and don't have a sustainable taxation policy or fiscal policy. So we will see what the market is doing. They haven't said it in these words, but I'm explaining what they said and what it means. And what the ECB will do is that if other countries like Italy and Spain also start with this growth in rates, then they will use this new instrument created to continue purchasing debt from Italy and Spain to avoid these peaks in rates. So, at the end of the day, monetary policy, there have been good news. The ECB, I believe, has done things quite well, taking into account the difficulties in this period. But still, we have pending some issues, and maybe we can discuss them later on in the panel session. Things that are still pending. The need to create a centralized fiscal tax capacity. I wouldn't be so optimistic or as optimistic as Federico regarding the budgets and having enough funds in EU to create that capacity and to fund all the enormous investments that we need. And I would ask myself, and to end, if really, or I would like to ask this to all of you, because Mr. Borrell says that Europe is the continent where we better solve the balance between equity, social justice, freedom, and financial efficiency. And I believe, and I didn't have enough time to explain this, but I believe there are specific risks that show that this model is now endangered. Not right now, but in the near future, in the next 20, 30 years, it could be in danger. And I would like you to see one last graph that would be a summary of the evolution of the growth of the Eurozone compared to the growth in Japan, US, and global growth. And it's a graph that exists since 1975, because we have to look at the trend. And the trend is that we are lagging behind in Europe. We know we've had competitiveness problems for some time now, but we are not able to implement the means to solve them. That's why now we find ourselves in these circumstances. In 50 years, our GDP, 2020, and the US 350. Yes, this is in real terms. Yes, that is so. So without the inflation in 50 years, the GDP of Europe has been multiplied by 2.2, and in the US by 3.5. Yes, this is something we've known for some time. And the global is the whole world. As there are many developing countries, it's normal for them to grow more. But we should try and grow like the US, but we are far away from that. And the reason for this distance, I believe, will be explained by Georgios. Because that's basically, well, there are many reasons, but fundamentally we are not able to innovate, and what's even worse, to use the innovations of others. Can you show us the next graph? Well, this is the graph on productivity, because long-term productivity is everything. We could say the GDP is not growing so much because we have less growth of the working population. Well, this is part of the problem, but it's not the fundamental problem. The problem is that each worker produces less, and that there is a growing gap in productivity on the long term, and therefore this risk of our model not being sustainable, and the greatest possibilities of this happening is if we, or if this not happening, is to make the most of technological advances, but we haven't been able to do so in the past. And I finish with this. Thank you. Thank you so much, Inma.
Vamos a ver ahora la componente tecnológica.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here with you today, and it has been a very great discussion. And what I'll try to do in the next 20 minutes is add another layer to this. Indeed, I will try to talk about technology as a key driver of competitiveness in Europe and how we can hopefully foster more of technological innovation in the next years. So, of course, you don't need me to tell you that we're living in an era of rapid technological advancements. New technologies are changing our everyday lives, and with that, our economies and our societies. Artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, quantum computing, they're all catalyzing significant paradigm shifts in our economic landscape. Just to some optimistic estimates, artificial intelligence alone is expected to grow the EU economy by 1.3 trillion euros and save the average worker about 70 hours a year. That's equivalent to about 2 working weeks. So it becomes apparent that in order to sustain competitiveness, to sustain growth, we need to innovate. We need to be technologically innovative. However, unfortunately, we're not doing that in Europe. The EU is infamously lagging when it comes to digital technologies. Let me give you some data to make this clear. The 7 largest US technology firms are right now valued at about $12 trillion. Europe's 7 largest tech firms are valued at about $700 billion. That's 20 times lower than their American counterparts. The EU also relies on about 80% to import its digital products, services, and infrastructure from elsewhere, and our share in the global ICT market has been significantly reduced. In 2013, we used to have 22% of the global share in the ICT market. In 2022, we have about 11%. So, of course, this spills over to all areas that are very critical to today's technological advancements. In semiconductors, in chips, Europe accounts for only about 10% of global production capacity, and even that is more about trailing edge chips, larger chips, not cutting edge chips. And then finally, in AI, only about 3% of the world's AI unicorn startups come from Europe, so 3%. 97% of unicorn startups in AI come from elsewhere. And it's not only technological innovation, it's also technological diffusion. So even when digital technologies are coming from elsewhere, we are slow at adopting them, at exploiting them, and at making use of them for economic growth. So if current trends persist, by 2030, European businesses will exploit AI only 20% of them. The target that the European Commission has set for itself for 2030 is 75%. So we already see that there is a huge gap growing there and that we need to do something about it. But before we see what we are to do about it, we must first understand why. Why is Europe lagging when it comes to technological innovation, whereas other jurisdictions such as the United States have seen a lot of success? And there are a few interpretations about this, and I think it's valuable to go over them because there is a very interesting debate in this as well. So the first interpretation of why Europe is lagging technologically, which is very popular, especially among industry, has to do with regulation, that the European Union overregulates. So, of course, digital technologies bring a lot of benefits to our economies, to our security, but they bring a lot of risks as well to our human rights, to our democracies. And in Europe, we have decided that we must act now preventively in order to prevent these risks from materializing and ensure that innovations are being developed and deployed in a safe manner for citizens and consumers. So, according to these values, in the last mandate from 2019 to 2024, there were about 108 pieces of legislation just for digital technologies. 95 of them were already adopted, and there are about 15 in the pipeline. You probably have heard of some very famous examples. For example, the Artificial Intelligence Act, which was the world's first attempt to regulate AI systems. The Digital Services Act, which seeks to regulate disinformation, illegal content in very large online platforms. The Cyber Resilience Act, and many, many others. So, of course, many experts in the industry have seen this regulatory fury, and they believe that it has driven tech innovators away. And there is, of course, some truth to that. Let me give you a more specific example. If you were tomorrow to start an AI startup here in Spain, and you wanted to develop AI systems that are considered high risk under the European legislation. Now, a high-risk system could be something such as an AI system in a medical application or in an education setting. If you wanted to do that, before anything else, before hiring, before developing your product, you will need to find an investment of about 100,000 euros to 300,000 euros just to comply with the AI Act and just for the first year of your operations. So it becomes clear that these regulations do have an impact, especially for small businesses, for startups, for SMEs, that they don't have these huge legal teams and financial resources to be able to comply with the legislation. So that is one possible interpretation, but there is another side to this debate, and it originates, I'd say, from a very interesting study that the Columbia professor Anu Bradford did, which looked at Europe's technological landscape and said that indeed today we are lagging very much when it comes to technological innovation, but so did we back in 2015, so did we back in 2005, so did we back in 2010, before all these regulations had been materialized, before even the GDPR was a thing, when the digital single market was regulated by one piece of law, which was the e-commerce directive. So Professor Bradford saw this, and therefore she thought that it must be other kind of like structural factors that are to blame for Europe's technological gap. And so she gives three possible explanations that are very interesting. The first possible explanation has to do with the fact that there isn't really a digital single market. Yes, we have done a lot of progress in further integrating in the last years, but there are still a lot of barriers that exist. So if you were to still go ahead and start your AI company tomorrow, you were not turned away by the high compliance costs, and you wanted to scale across Europe, so not only stay here in Spain, you would be faced with 27 different bureaucracies, 27 different business cultures, and 24 different official languages. So it is possible to do it, but definitely you have a much more challenging task than what your competitors in the United States are doing. Now, the second structural factor that Professor Bradford identifies has to do with finance. The United States tech ecosystem has largely benefited from its venture capital ecosystem. Now, in Europe, we lack this feature, and innovators have to turn to banks in order to be able to finance their operations. And as you mentioned as well, it is much harder to finance your innovation from banks because they are much more risk averse. So that is another factor that is playing into that. And then finally, the third factor that probably plays a significant role is our bankruptcy laws. It is very costly and very difficult to go bankrupt in Europe, and there is a very interesting study from the OECD where they measured things such as the cost of entrepreneurship, where they saw, let's say, how many years does it take entrepreneurs to get rid of their debts after they go bankrupt, or what kind of personal assets are carved out from the insolvency process. So they measured that, and they saw that in the countries that it is easier and less costly to go bankrupt, it is the United States and Canada, whereas the more difficult countries to go bankrupt is European countries such as Portugal, the Czech Republic, and other EU member states. So that definitely plays a role for potential innovators, and it's not just the laws, it's also the culture. In the United States, entrepreneurs are wearing failure as a badge of honor. It is on the road to their success, whereas in Europe, I would say that failure is definitely more looked down upon. Okay, so far we have seen what the debate is about why Europe is lagging when it comes to technological innovation. So the question, of course, now becomes what is to be done. We have now a new mandate from 2024 to 2029, which will be a very much critical decade for technological innovation, for new technologies. What are some steps to take? And I will try to go over now 3 plus 1 step that I believe are very important. So the first one is that we need to build a regulatory environment that is more conducive to business innovating. Yes, of course, we saw that regulation is not to blame for all of Europe's faults, but it still plays a significant role, and it can raise a higher barrier to enter the market for smaller players. Therefore, the answer is not to deregulate, it's not to scrap these regulations that are also are playing a very important role in protecting us from risks to our fundamental rights. But the answer is that these regulations that we have adopted, we make sure we implement them in a way that is as clear as possible and imposes as little cost as necessary. Now, in this context of building such environment, the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta had a very interesting proposal in his high-level report that he published a few months ago that was about expanding the 4 fundamental freedoms of the single market to a 5th one, the freedom to research and innovate. Now, this can, concretely, this can mean many things. It is a framework policy proposal, but more concretely, it can mean things like harmonizing tech regulations across all EU member states, so innovators can scale their operations more easily. It can also mean scrutinizing existing laws, scrutinizing all these 108 regulations to make sure there are no duplications and that entrepreneurs don't have to go through the same process twice. It can also mean setting up regulatory innovation offices, so sort of one-stop shops where innovators can go and ask questions in order to be able to navigate the bureaucracy more easily. And finally, another tool that I think is very important in this endeavor are regulatory sandboxes. Now, you may have heard of them, but these are government instruments where they provide a safe physical and digital environments for innovators to develop their products and test them without becoming compliant, but also without entering the market. So it all happens under government supervision. And in the fintech industry, where the concept has originated from, it has given a lot of benefits to entrepreneurs and a lot of legal certainty. So there is no reason why we shouldn't apply this instrument to all other sectors, such as AI, quantum computing, and others. And indeed, the AI Act includes such provision. Now, this is, of course, a very complex and hard task to do, but I think this might be the most crucial step, because if we do this right, European companies can actually gain a competitive advantage. Because imagine that you are able to develop your products here in Europe, comply with the legislation that you need to comply with, and then you go on the global markets and you sell your systems and you say, I have the most ethical, the most trustworthy a digital product, the most ethical AI system in the world, because I am compliant with the EU regulation. That is a very strong brand proposal, and of course we must be able to take advantage of that. So that is the first leg of the strategy that I think is important. Now, the second part that will be very much important in the next 5 years is, of course, finance, mobilizing investments, both private and public. Now, to start with the private side of things, we saw how in the US tech ecosystem, what was a large factor of success was the venture capital ecosystem of the United States. Now, the reason there is a thriving venture capital ecosystem in the United States has to do with a little regulatory change that was passed about 50 years ago that allowed pension funds and insurance funds in the United States to invest in more high-risk, high-reward investments, such as venture capital, such as technology investments. And for example, there is no reason why we cannot examine to do something similar in the European Union. And indeed, the UK examined such measures last year. There is about 13 trillion of assets in pension and insurance funds right now in Europe. If we incentivize fund managers to even rebalance a little portion of these assets into high risk, high reward investments, we can manage to funnel billions of euros into tech entrepreneurship. Now, of course, as we were seeing before the data, Europe's gaps are very large. So, of course, we will also have to see how public finance and public investment plays into the mix, into the equation, because it is absolutely necessary in order to cover our gaps. Now, this is, of course, where this emerging discussion about industrial policy has focused on, and we heard quite a bit about that. We saw how one example of industrial policy in the last mandate was the CHIPS Act, where the EU identified that we have a significant shortage of semiconductors developed in Europe, and that we are much dependent on other supply chains that may be fragile as well. So it set out to double the production by mobilizing about 44 billion euros in both public and private funds. So we expect to see much more of that in the next mandate, and indeed in the 2024-2029 political guidelines of President von der Leyen, she proposes the idea of a competitiveness fund, which would invest in strategic technologies. Now, of course, it is very important to see the details, and more details have not been announced regarding that, because, of course, the quantity of the funds will be very important in that regard. Now, finally, another way in which you can apply industrial policy when it comes to digital technologies is through digital public infrastructure. And that means mobilizing investments and directing them towards public ownership of digital infrastructure. And let me give you an example of why this may be important. Let's take computing power, which is a very much an essential part of building any kind of technological product, but even more so for frontier AI models, where it's also a very expensive component of that. So because it is so expensive, we have seen a phenomenon that any kind of startup in AI, any kind of small business that becomes successful, at some point falls in the laps of hyperscalers that come from the United States, such as Microsoft, such as Amazon, and it is because they need access to their computing capacity, to their computing resources in order to train their models. So something, for example, that member states could consider when it comes to this regard is stepping in order to provide compute as a public good in order for European startups to be able to train their models. Now, finally, and I'm conscious of the time and I want to leave some time for questions as well, but the final leg of the strategy that I think is very important to also mention is skills. It is absolutely essential to have the right people with the right skills in Europe and in the right positions. And according to current trends, we will have about 12 million technology experts in Europe by 2030, but the demand for technology experts will be 20 million. So there will be an 8 million shortage if current trends persist, which will, of course, hamper the capacity of European companies to go digital, to attract investments, to become more competitive. So it is very important that we work towards fixing that. Now, of course, this also spills over to other critical technology areas as well. In semiconductors, we will probably be faced with a shortage of about 350,000 experts in the technology that are very much vital if we want to double our production in Europe. Now, we're not doing everything bad. Actually, there was a good upside when it comes to talent and attracting talent last year, because we became, for the first time, a net importer of technology talent from the United States. So there was about 8,500 talented individuals when it comes to technology that arrived from the United States last year, whereas we lost about 8,000 to the other side of the Atlantic. So it's important that we maintain this trend and that we accelerate it. And of course, we have now the US presidential election. There is a lot of uncertainty of what's going to happen, but it might be an opportunity for Europe to actually brand itself for talents that are actually now residing in the United States as a more stable environment, as an environment that is more prone to technological innovation. So that is definitely another thing to think about. Now, I want to wrap it up to also have some time for questions, but there is a final leg, of course, and my colleagues in the panel spoke about it a lot because it has to do with economic security. So I won't go into a lot of details about it. Maybe we can cover in the questions. But of course, as we live in an era of geopolitical tensions and technology has become very much a contested area